folks wanted that, but I'm recording now as well, so that people who are unable to attend today will be able to do that. So I'd like to introduce Danilyn Rutherford, president of the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, and a friend of mine for a really, really, really long time, since our Indonesia days. So we go way back, and I'm so thankful for you to be here. This is a really important and constantly shifting set of conversations. Danilyn is doing a set of posts for Wenner-Gren that I've written a piece for. That was a great chance for me to think about some of this. And it's interesting, like in some ways I feel like, oh, now so much has already changed, but that's the whole point, is we need to think not just in terms of the crisis after crisis, but how are we moving forward for this? And so Wenner-Gren has been a real center for thinking about these conversations, and I, among others, are so thankful that you have done that. And I'm so incredibly thankful that you've come here today. We all really, really appreciate it. And, you know, we'll open up the floor for you to talk, and then we'll get, you know, Q&A. And we had a really great conversation with Jeff Mance recently, and, you know, then the questions ranged from sort of high level things about the future of anthropological research to like, is the deadline going to be changed next fall? So there we got sort of the whole, which is great, you know, whole gamut of questions from the audience. So I expect there'll be that same kind of thing. And so, you know, take it away, and I'll keep an eye on the participant list.
Great, that's fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for having me here. Yes, we have blogs to come. So Tom's piece, which was wonderful, will be featured soon on our blog page on our website. Yeah, so I wanted to just like share with you, you know, what Wenner-Gren's response has been to the pandemic, some of the nuts and bolts, the background to our response, which I think is equally important. Some remarks on the challenges facing all of us as anthropological researchers. And then just some quick tips. I know some of you are probably thinking about how to design projects in this moment. So just a couple of tips based on what we've been doing with our applicants and grantees. And basically, I want to talk to you guys as prospective applicants. You know, everyone in anthropology world is always a prospective applicant for Wenner-Gren. We'd love to fund you all. But I also am thinking about, especially you guys who are graduate students, as really the newest generation of anthropological thinkers. And you're all facing enormous challenges, but you also have enormous opportunities. You know, it seems to me this is a really critical moment for our discipline, and you guys in your cohorts and your generation are going to be really key for determining what we look like on the other side. So I'm going to share my screen because I have some images. Oh, host disabled attendee screen sharing. Okay. Tom, you may need to.
I just made you a co-host, so give it a shot now. I just made you a co-host.
Okay, great. All right. Let me just is there a refresh button? No. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right. Desktop one. Okay.
I'll let you know when we see it.
Yeah, it's a slightly different interface than you usually get on Zoom, so that's peculiar. Okay. Ah, interesting. So Zoom will not be able to record the contents of your screen until it is quit. Okay, later. All right.
If you have to reboot, that's fine. I could, that's irritating.
Let me see.
Here, I'm gonna try making you a full host.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure you can do that, but.
Yeah, you are. You're the host now.
The future is here and it doesn't.
You are the host.
No, oh, really?
There we go. Now it's working.
Way too much responsibility. Okay, all right. If you trust me, Tom, I will try not to abuse my power here. Great. Okay, so you guys can see my slides now. Is that right? Can you guys see the slides? Okay, great.
Yeah, we see them. They look great.
Okay, cool. All right, let me make sure my controls work. All right, great. So I just want to start out with just a list, just a real quick list of some of the things we've done. And I know, news about a bunch of these things is spread, but just to kind of go over the range of measures that we took. One of the first things we did was we extended the review process for our November 1, 2019 applicants. We were about to make funding decisions, and we added a stage where they could submit additional information on how their projects could still be feasible under current conditions. We suspended face-to-face. We asked our active grantees to suspend face-to-face research, and then we have invited them to redesign their projects so that they can continue to work under current conditions. We ended up canceling the May 1st deadline for dissertation fieldwork and post-PhD research grants with the understanding that the situation was so uncertain. It was really unclear how people would be able to come up with feasible projects on such short notice. We doubled the number of Hunt fellowships we were giving away. We took our conference and workshop grant program, and we're just devoting it to virtual events for this round. The due date is like today for that. We had the first round of our Global Initiatives grant, and we prioritized projects that were involved in capacity building in the context of COVID-19's impact on anthropology. We are continuing kind of our planning for launching an engaged research grant program, which would be grants at the same level as our regular research grants, but for work that is collaborative from the get-go and throughout all of the process. And as Tom was mentioning, we've had a conversation on ethics, methods, and questions in the era of COVID-19. We started out with a group of ethnographic researchers, senior people who work with students. Our next meeting is going to be with anthropologists who don't use ethnographic methods. So it's with a biological anthropologist and archaeologist, and we'll be holding that conversation and generating some more blog posts after that. And probably the last one will involve researchers who are doing work that's directly relevant to the pandemic. So, these conversations are the nexus of ethics, methods, and questions, not just taking one at a time, but thinking about how they need to work together in the new era. So that's kind of like the list of things we've done. But I want to kind of talk a little bit about the background to our response. And I find I can't talk about Wenner-Gren. I can't do workshops or anything without talking a bit about our history, because it really makes a difference in our approach to funding and the sorts of things we're looking to support. So the Wenner-Gren Foundation was founded by two men who knew nothing about the discipline. One of these men was Axel Wenner-Gren, Swedish industrialist, the founder of the Electrolux Corporation. Think refrigerators, vacuum cleaners. He was one of the richest men of his generation. This was his pleasure yacht, which is basically like an ocean liner. In his travels, he was also a global, globetrotter. In his travels, he met with this man, the man on the far right, Paul Feos, who was a Hungarian avant-garde filmmaker. At that point, Feos, who had a very promising start in Hollywood, had trouble kind of like making successful films after his first successful film, and decided to try his hand at ethnographic filmmaking. And he was the one who convinced Wenner-Gren to devote the foundation he just created to anthropology. Now, this foundation was basically, Wenner-Gren had to sell a yacht in Florida. He needed a place to park the money. He created the Viking Fund, which was for the betterment of whatever. And Feos was the one who says, yeah, you should use this for anthropology. In the first instance, to fund an amateur archaeology expedition that the two of them took to Peru. And then Feos came back to the US, became the first leader of the foundation, and set out to learn what anthropology is. So the point of this story, which has lots of interesting twists and turns that I won't, delay us with now, but the point of it is that it's a grand historical accident that Wenner-Gren exists. And I think for me and for all of our staff and our reviewers, everyone who's part of our community, we feel an enormous responsibility to support anthropology. I mean, one of our former grantees once told me, it's like, you can come to Wenner-Gren for funding and you don't have to pretend you're anything other than an anthropologist, And so this has really kind of been important in everything we do, and it's been important in the current moment. So we recently went through a strategic planning process and came up with a mission statement. It was the first time we'd done anything like this since 1987. Our mission: advancing knowledge, amplifying impact, addressing precarity, fostering an inclusive vision of the field. You know, came up with, you know, priorities sort of around this general mission. And really, if you kind of look at this mission statement, it does affect how we have handled, in particular, safety and security issues in the past. Now, our view has always been that anthropologists are the experts, you know, that part of what distinguishes our field is the prioritization we put on people's local and very contextually specific kinds of knowledge. You know, obviously, when we fund a project, there are institutional constraints, there are IRBs, you know, we have to deal with the federal, US government and OFIC regulations, et cetera. But once we kind of get through these things, once, you know, grantee has, you know, convinced us that they have really thought through the safety and ethical issues around their projects, we really end up trusting them. You know, we're always there to help them in times of trouble, you know, to rebudget, if they need to evacuate, if anything comes up in the field, we try to make that really clear to people. But we don't kind of go in and dictate. We don't tell people that they need to stop their research, right? It's not something that we have historically done. So COVID-19 put us in a really weird position. And I think back on these, you know, basically between March 9th and March 16th, it was a really weird moment in history for the foundation. The foundation tends to be very steady in the way we do things. And suddenly we were in a position where we were having to act really quickly. And, you know, the impetus from this action came both from our grantees and our reviewers. I got an email from a grantee. She was in the midst of research in Cuba and was about to start a phase of her research that involved, you know, being out in public, talking to people from different communities, and just doing really intensive face-to-face public kinds of fieldwork. And at that point, the Cuban government wasn't issuing any recommendations or restrictions, but she was following global news. And basically she's like, what should I do? I need advice from you. You know, field work is the opposite of social distancing, is what she wrote to us. You know, and I think, you know, her need to come to us kind of reflected, you know, the notion that sometimes people have when they're in the midst of a research project, that their grant is a contract if they're not doing exactly 40 interviews with these 50 people, right? You know, or these, you know, 5 different groups, that they're in some sense going to get the money taken away. I mean, that's never the case, right? But I think that there was some of that anxiety out there. And that really kind of like shaped our response, right? So we did end up getting in touch with all of our active grantees and asked them to, if, you know, strongly recommended suspending research involving face-to-face contact. We also heard from reviewers, you know, and I got a very blunt reviewer from, you know, a friend and colleagues who's basically, how are we supposed to be evaluating the feasibility of these grants in these uncertain times? You know, how does this possibly make sense? Right, so that actually was something that also we were thinking about, you know, is it really responsible to complete this review, you know, at this point when it's not really clear that any of these projects are going to be feasible as written. You know, and so, right, and thinking about how we responded to this, we were guided by our priorities, you know. We do have an ethical commitment to those impacted by our research. You know, that was really part of it, and this decision to ask researchers to suspend face-to-face methods really had to do with that. You know, this notion that researchers in the field are really vectors. You know, the whole point of our work is to move across boundaries among different groups of people. So we had to think about that. But we're also thinking about our ethical commitment to the discipline's survival and the flourishing of those who do it, right? And that's also been really important in how we kind of are thinking about moving forward. We would like to return to the past position, you know, in which we are really trusting anthropologists to know the context in which they work. And we're hoping to do that as soon as possible. We know there's going to be rough sailing ahead, you know, that anthropology as a community, we're going to need to develop locally attuned ways of determining what's safe and ethical and what's not. And this is in a situation in which knowledge can be really unevenly distributed. We want to support as many anthropologists as possible. We really want to get money to anthropologists right now to do their work. It's a very important moment in which anthropologists should be doing research, should be observing what's happening in the world right now and intervening in any way we can. But we really need to know that we're ready for the challenges that lie ahead. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about kind of what I see as some of these challenges. And one of these challenges is intellectual. it seems to me grant proposals are always fictive, right? They indicate how in touch with the world and the issues the applicant is interested in they are, right? And whether or not they're able to formulate a viable plan for exploring the world and exploring these issues that they really want to understand. Grant proposals are written at a particular point in time. The things we study have a temporality. Not everything changes between, say, November 1st of one year and April of the next when someone finds out whether or not they've been funded. But certain things definitely do, and they do in quote unquote normal times as well as in these very uncertain global times. When we fund someone, we are endorsing not just a project, but a thinker who's capable of coming up with anthropological ways of knowing the world. And that is always the case. We know that every time we approve a grant. It seems to me that current times are placing demands on anthropologists as thinkers that are more extreme than usual. And I don't happen to think these are bad demands. I think they're demanding virtues that should always be there. The world is always changing out from under us when we do our research. Projects rarely unfold as we would expect. And it seems to me that, the challenge that we're facing right now is to get beyond a narrow kind of empiricism. I have a piece that was on the American Ethnologist blog, sort of the future of anthropological research in the age of COVID-19. And in this, I talk about my auntie Fernando's take on Rolf Trejo's insistence on the difference between an object of study and an object of observation. In the case of my auntie's research, it's the difference between, her research, her object of observation was, the lives of Muslim French in Paris. But that wasn't the same as her object of study. Her object of study was French secularism and all of the governmental and institutional structures through which it was implemented. And it seems like in this moment, we really need to think about that difference and how we can zoom out to the broader phenomenon we want to explore, okay? Recognizing that the sorts of questions that make for good anthropological research questions can be gotten at through multiple routes. Now, of course, the route a researcher takes to get at a question changes the question. You need to understand, how these things all work together and to approach changes to your projects with a disciplined sensibility. You want to know as much as you possibly can, but also be open to knowing more. And it seems to me that this is a moment where we're going to see great demonstrations of creativity, which comes from having prior knowledge that sets constraints on what is significant to observe and what you make of it. So working between contingency and constraint, I think, is going to be really important. Educating ourselves as far as we can about the phenomenon we want to explore, but really being open to new ways of getting at them. Research is not going to turn out as expected in these current times, but it is going to turn out, and it's going to become the basis for saying something that's important and new. Anthropology at its best is very, very well suited to these sorts of moments of uncertainty. So that's kind of the first thing, right? So you guys, who are just starting out in the field, you're super disadvantaged relative to other cohorts of researchers, that have been in the past, but you also have a unique opportunity to apply anthropological ways of knowing in a period that's in some ways world historical, that's bringing into sharp focus the sorts of phenomena that anthropologists are uniquely suited to make sense of. I think we have the ways of knowing that the moment demands, and all of us in the discipline are just going to learn a lot from you and from your research. But you're going to have to be as nimble as possible. So that's like challenge number one. The second challenge I see is methodological, right? So Yael Navarro, who was part of, our first conversation, included Tom, she had some really interesting things to say about a Daniel Miller YouTube video that's been circulating, how to conduct ethnography during social isolation. And Yael points out that, Danny Miller, exudes a can-do philosophy. He wants to talk about all the sorts of things that we still can do ethnographically by using digital means. But she felt we also need to pay homage to what we can't do. How are we going to grapple with what's lost, with the loss of the kind of first-person experience that so much anthropological research depends on? And I think the point that she was making, and it's a point I endorse, that the online alone is not the answer. And it seems to me as well that this change really is an opportunity it seems, to reflect more critically on the conditions that make first-person experience possible in the first place. You know, just to take it even further, this can't do moment should also lead us to think about things we don't do, but maybe should. You know, what this generation of researchers is going to be forced to do, to have an opportunity to do, is a bunch of things that I think we've tended to overlook in our rush to the face-to-face, the dirt if you're an archaeologist, to the samples if you're a biological anthropologist. You know, it's going to give us a chance to really think a little bit more critically about the fiction of unmediated access. So these things that you and your cohort of researchers are going to have a chance to do, you know, include developing contextual knowledge, developing comparative knowledge, developing historical knowledge, learning from other researchers' data sets, right? Okay. Learning to be an ally or a critic by learning from other allies or critics. All of these things that we often don't take as much time as we should to do. You know, in a sense, I mean, not to be self-indulgent, but, you know, at this moment, I've been thinking a lot about my own dissertation fieldwork. And, you know, I stumbled onto this project in West Papua, you know, where no one had gotten permission to do ethnography since 1965. And I had, you know, it seemed like there might be some opening to get there, but it wasn't at all clear it was going to come through. So I had to, you know, think about my project with the understanding that there was a chance that I would never actually be able to go to Biak. So, you know, I built a whole lot of historical work into it. You know, as it happened, I got, you know, a Wenner-Gren grant and, you know, a couple of others, and ended up spending 6 months going back and forth to the archives in the Netherlands before, you know, I finally received the permit. In the end, it was actually a really useful thing. It gave me avenues of inquiry I wouldn't have otherwise had. And it also really improved my relationships with all of the Biak historians that I met. You know, it's sort of like vernacular history is really a thing on this island. And I was really able to engage with them with a much higher level of sophistication than I would have otherwise. You know, we'd read the same things. In some cases, they'd met the people who had written them. You know, it just really enriched my fieldwork in all sorts of ways. You know, which kind of connects me, you know, kind of leads me to the next challenge, which I feel like is directly connected with these methodological issues, which is the ethical challenge. You know, the can't do moment also brings to light a problematic assumption that's long been present in many European and North American traditions of anthropology, which is we should be free to go wherever and talk to whomever, and that there's no cost of entry or a little cost of entry. And it seems to me that perhaps there should be. You know, assuming that you can go in and simply interview people, wasting their time learning things that you could have learned before arriving, that reflects a particular kind of arrogance. You know, and I'm not accusing anyone of this, not anyone in this room, but I'm saying that this is a moment to actually sit back and really reflect on some of these assumptions that have been built into the way that we plan research. It seems to me in this moment, we all have a unique opportunity to address ethical issues that don't always come to the forefront when we're talking about our plans, right? You know, and right, there's some interesting ideas about this that have come out of archaeology in recent years. You know, a senior scholar wrote this essay in which, you know, this person talked about archaeology's dirty little secret. You know, again, in archaeology, it takes the form of you have the right to go and dig up new stuff when archaeologists have gone before you and they've amassed mountains of unanalyzed data and artifacts. And that gets back to what I was talking about, drawing on other scholars' data sets, other scholars' field notes. You know, it's like we really need to think about this because it can justify a certain violence. You know, for ethnographers, you're wasting people's time and energy. For archaeologists, you may be destroying their heritage, right? We really need to think about, you know, what should be the cost of entry and what are some of the things that we can do before actually getting to that face-to-face moment. You know, it just seems like this is a time at which the cost to participants of our research really needs to be recognized. Risks need to be openly dealt with, you know, and just to sort of narrow, there are all sorts of risks to participants involved in our research. You know, just to narrow it down to the virus, right? It's just like, it's not just the people who you're going to interview, you know, the people you're going to take samples from, or who are going to work on your dig, who are potentially impacted by your work, but everyone involved in getting you to this place, right? So really thinking about the broader frame through which you actually get to your research site. you know, and I know that there are, you know, anthropologists in various parts of the world who are really thinking hard about, like, what are the ethical stakes of doing research right now. Aparecida Valaca was another member of our discussion group, and you know, she was saying, like, right now, you know, Brazilian anthropologists have concluded that it's not the time for indigenous research on, you know, it's not the time for research on indigenous people at all. It's the time for anthropologists to be in solidarity with them. So really thinking about this issue, you know, thinking broadly, not only about what you can do, but why it's worth being done in this moment, you know. There was an excellent WCAWAU, that's the World Council of Anthropology Associations and the World Anthropological Union. They did a webinar on fieldwork in a pandemic, and one of the participants was Aida Hernandez, who's a Mexican anthropologist. You know, she was talking about how you might be doing work in which activist organizations have reports that might help you, right? But why should you? Why should they help you if what you're studying doesn't help them in their work? So it seems to me the same time we think about these sort of narrow ethical issues connected to the virus, we also want to think about some of these broader issues. This is a moment at which people all over the world are facing enormous difficulties and hardships. It's a moment at which all sorts of multidimensional crises that people are living in, you know, are coming to the fore. What more than right at this moment in the United States? We really need to think not just, you know, whether my research can be done, but why my research should be done. And just so I don't give you the wrong impression, that doesn't mean that every project should be about COVID-19, right? You know, projects can be about beautiful and fragile things that are risking disappearing from the world. They could be about poetics, they could be about all sorts of things, but they should be about things that are meaningful to the people involved, the people who are going to be participating in your research. It seems like this is something that the moment really uniquely demands. So that's kind of like the sermon part of my presentation. I just want to give you a few tips on redesigning your project to fit the new normal. And this is kind of coming out of the processes that we put in place for our active grantees and for our you know, current applicants, right? You know, we added this extra step, right? So, you know, what are some of the things you'll need to think about? And I know some of you might be thinking about applying at the November 1st, 2020 deadline. You know, we're going to be sort of thinking about, you know, that application process. It seems to me it's likely we're going to be adding a question to the application, you know, but whether or not we do, you really want to be thinking about your proposal with an eye to global uncertainties, you know, which means you're going to need to be thinking about having a plan B, you know. So if you're in the process of trying to design a project right now, I would really take that into account. You know, so, right, one of the things that we're expecting to see in these proposals is a new type of research focus, right? I just want to talk about the different parts of it, the focus, the evidence you collect, budgets, and timelines, just to kind of like get to the nitty gritty a little bit. So your research focus, you know, from what you anticipated when you began graduate school, there may be COVID-19 related changes to the phenomenon you want to explore. I mean, at these points when you're going to have to be much more nimble methodologically, those methodology related changes also are going to lead to adjustments in your research question, your research focus. And then third, just to sort of pick up on what I was talking about a moment ago, you know, there may be changes to your research focus that are connected to changes in the interest and commitments of the people who are going to be participating in it. So, you know, you want to kind of like have a question that's broad and intellectually deep enough that allows you to approach it from different angles. So if you sort of, you know, get midway through your research and there's another lockdown, you'll be able to have different sorts of ways of exploring the things that you want to explore. Okay. And what I've been advising, like, again, our active grantees and our, you know, current applicants is they really need to think about how to make their projects robust for the worst case scenario, where you're not able to travel, you're not able to use conventional research methods. What will you do and what will you learn? You know, how can you still learn things that are important and new? Is your question the kind of question that you can address through deep contextualizing, historicizing, alliance building from afar? So I would encourage all of you to think about the worst case scenario. I know all of us as anthropologists, and again, get this strong impression talking to, you know, applicants, grantees, and just folks out in the world. We're going through a bit of a period of mourning. And I think a lot of people have been at the denial phase where they're simply like, I just put off starting my research until I can do my research exactly as I designed it. And, you know, we've been gently encouraging people kind of not to take that position because we really don't know when or if the world is going to change, return to the, you know, whatever the status quo ante that allowed us to operate as we used to operate. I think that these changes are really permanent in some ways. So you really do need to think about the full range of scenarios in which you may be working. Does your question take into account your research participants' interest and priorities and the impact of the current situation on their lives? You know, again, is it a not only question that can be answered, but should be answered. So really, again, thinking about what is the meaning of the work that you want to do right now. So we're expecting also to see applicants collecting new kinds of evidence, you know, doing archival work, comparative work, epistolary work, you know, involving letters. You know, again, Naida Hernandez was talking about her work with, you know, women, incarcerated women in Mexico that involves sort of like journaling and so on. You know, it's sort of research at a distance, ethnography at a distance doesn't always involve computers. So thinking broadly about that. Thinking about drawing on existing field notes and data sets. At Wenner-Gren, we have a historical archive program where we provide funding, you know, to help scholars or their, you know, descendants prepare materials for deposition at the Smithsonian, you know, anthropological archives. There are also anthropology archives in other parts of the world. So are there existing data sets from people who've worked in the same place, you know, or in similar places that you could read with a different kind of eye, you know, an eye to questions other than what they were written for. You know, gray literature is a wonderful source of information and insight, media analysis, working with museum collections, and then online interviews and observation, etc. And there's, you know, there's some interesting resources that are out there. I think there are going to be even more going forward. Deborah Lipton has a crowdsourced document that you can access through the AAA website. I think it's called Fieldwork in a Pandemic. Also, Daniel Miller's YouTube video, which I mentioned above, is actually super useful. There's also a COVID and UCL, University College London, a website. And again, like I mentioned, the WCA, WAU webinar yesterday, you know, really some interesting points there, including from Pam McGrath, who works with Australian Land Councils. And that recording is available on their website. So if you look around, you know, there are ideas floating around. I've also been in conversation with, you know, someone's interested in doing webinars on kind of various sorts of data mining approaches that one could use to doing online ethnography. You know, you guys, of course, are lucky because you have Tom who can, you know, help you with all of these methods. But yeah, thinking creatively, but just like also thinking about contextual historical knowledge and how you kind of look back at the record that already exists. You know, these are all going to be good ideas, things to think about as you're going forward with your planning. And then finally, new approaches to ethics, okay? And there's a question of access, you know, how do you get access in the worst case scenario? You know, if you're doing online interviews or participant observation, you know, why should people want to help you with it? You know, so really thinking about how you're going to build relationships with people from afar, that's actually very important. There are also some nuts and bolts ethical issues to think about in terms of access. You know, what technology are you planning to use and what inequalities are built into that technology? You know, thinking about access also should lead you to think about, whatever, to use a scientific term, it should be leading you to think about sampling. Like, who can you talk to? Under what conditions? What are those conversations like? You know, all the sorts of things that we should be good at thinking about as anthropologists, you really want to be thinking about when you're worrying about the logistics of your project. You know, there are ethical issues too. I mean, one of the ironies, and I don't know if Jeff Nance mentioned this to you, if this is still the case, but I remember I talked to him about a month ago and he said it's super ironic what's happening in IRB is that, you know, what used to be really carefully scrutinized research, high risk, high reward medical research, if it's connected to COVID-19, is getting expedited. What used to be really non-controversial, regular face-to-face ethnography, is completely off the table. And then it's sort of like face-to-face methods are exempt. They're not even looking at them, right? And I think that's actually quite wrong, because there are ethical risks to participants with face-to-face methods. So you really want to think about some of these things too, questions of anonymity, surveillance, et cetera. And I know it's complicated in some ways. You know, you're even more secure if you're doing online methods. But again, just showing that you've thought about that, I would really encourage you to begin thinking about these sorts of issues now. You know, we'll want you to think about, you know, what are the risks to participants? What are the risks to others affected by your research? And then what are your debts to participants, right? How are you going to recognize participants as co-producers of knowledge? If you look at some of these sort of guides that are being provided and look at some of these creative new methods, they involve a really heavy investment on the part of research participants. If they're kind of doing autoethnography on their day-to-day existence, that's a really heavy load on someone, right? So how are you going to recognize their role in co-producing the knowledge that you're creating? You know, we've begun to look at project redesigns from our active grantees. I just looked at one this morning that was actually really interesting, where the researcher has research assistants that she's worked with intensively, you know, and kind of like in a previous project, who's, you know, getting her master's degree in sociology, and she is going to be the full kind of co-PI on this project, right? She's going to continue to do the research in the rural settings, you know, where this project was supposed to unfold. And then she's including in her budget, you know, funding to actually fly her research assistant to, you know, Sydney, Australia, if it is possible. And then the two of them will work together kind of on analysis and the production of publications. So, you know, again, really thinking about co-production. How do you kind of like bring other voices in and acknowledge the fact that ethnography is always co-produced? So budgets, just a few tips on the budget. And basically, my tip if you're applying to Wenner-Gren is go for the maximum, right? You know, and think creatively about how you would reallocate your funds as needed. And, you know, these are the sorts of things we're covering for people in their redesigns. You know, this is sort of the worst case scenario. What sorts of things could we do to support someone, you know, who is doing research in the place where they're living right now? And we will pay your rent, we will pay your utilities, we will buy you food, we will provide a per diem. You know, a lot of the things I think that have been restricted in the past for people who are not traveling, we're throwing those barriers out the window, right? So, you know, we really want to be able to support, especially graduate students, you know, who are often in really precarious situations in this moment. Research assistance, a much higher degree of it. Dependent care, you know, we're waiving some of the restrictions we've had around this. We've always provided dependent care for people who need to bring their dependents with them to do research. Now we'll provide it for people who are doing research from their home places, and we'll no longer have the kind of requirement that there not be another sort of adult in the house, another kind of individual in the house who can share in that care. So, you know, that's something that we're going to be much more generous about. Gifts for informants. You know, how are people compensated for the work they're doing? You know, we're encouraging people to think creatively about that. One of our grantees, you know, who has an engaged research grant, you know, is including actually household supplies, you know, just really thinking about what are some of the things that people need right now, you know, where, you know, the researcher could be helpful. So thinking broadly about that. Internet access for participant, equipment for participants, cell phones, that's something that people are thinking about asking for. Transcription and translation expenses. You know, if you're kind of working with archives where the archival materials aren't online, you know, often it's the case that you can get a curator or, you know, archivist to kind of like send you photocopies of documents and so on. So we'll cover that cost, the reproduction cost, the postage, et cetera. There are things that we've not even thought of, you know, that you might be able to include in your budget. So really, you know, think broadly about how we can support you while you're doing your research, because that really, you know, is what we would like to do. And finally, there will be new timelines. I mean, we will still, I'm sure, be asking you to provide us with a precise timeline, but, you know, in these times, we're being flexible in extensions, we're being flexible in the content of final reports, and we're being flexible on the reallocation of funds. So kind of as I see it right now, the proposal is probably going to be kind of a best case kind of proposal, but you're also going to need to show evidence that you've thought about, you know, what the plan B would look like, how you would continue to be able to produce interesting and important new knowledge in a situation in which you weren't able to do what you wanted to do. So changes to your timeline are also something that could potentially potentially come in there. So that's just like some quick tips. And I just wanted to end, before we open it up to discussion, just with some points to keep in mind. I mean, again, if you're thinking about Wenner-Gren and what our position is, you know, these are sort of good principles to remember. We want to support as much anthropological research as we can. As I said before, you know, we have an ethical commitment to the well-being of those impacted by our research, but we also have an ethical commitment to the field and to researchers. So, you know, we really want to make it possible for graduate students in particular to move forward with their careers. We want to do what we can to support precarious scholars. You know, we know that precarious scholars at this moment are facing just enormous obstacles with budget cuts coming, you know, with all of the sort of problems the world is throwing up. We want to help them to the extent that our resources allow us to. We have an ethical obligation to those affected by our research. We're taking a long view. I mean, this is just one moment in a longer history, both for you as researchers and for the discipline, right? So again, part of being nimble is being able to take the long view. You know, for your dissertation project, you may not be able to do exactly the kind of work that you came to Irvine to do, but you're going to do work and it's going to be useful, and it's going to be just one moment in a longer career. You know, in the future, you may be able to double back and kind of like do some of those things that you wanted to do. What you're doing right now, you know, what impact it has on your future career, you can't anticipate it at this moment. But if it's good, honest, focused, creative work, it's definitely going to help you. You know, so again, taking the longer view, not pressuring yourself too much if you can't do exactly what you expected to do. I think that's really going to be important for, you know, the health, our own mental health, and the health of the discipline as well. I guess the other thing, Wenner-Gren, we have faith in the current generation of researchers. You know, I'm horrified at the challenges the field is facing, but I also know that this is a field that has nimbleness built into it. It has ethical sensibility at its best built into it, intellectual flexibility at its best built into it. And, you know, just from what I know of the current generations of researchers, from what I see in all of the applications I look at, you know, I think that this is going to end up being an important and in many ways productive moment for the discipline. So, you know, I have faith in all of you guys. And just the final point is, we're going to learn from all of you. You know, this is kind of a moment at which this whole notion that you have senior scholars who are mentors and junior scholars who receive their mentorship, I think that's all going to be scrambled, because I think that the things that you guys are learning as the COVID-19 generation are just going to be incredibly important for pointing the way forward for the discipline as a whole. So, so that's kind of all I have to say. And yeah, I'm happy to open discussion.
Thank you so much for that. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Good. Yeah, no, thank you so much. And that was a great, you know, showing us, walking us through those things. And as someone who is going to be one of the reviewers for these redone, you know, Wenner-Gren proposals, it was really, I won't be doing Irvine, I won't be reading Irvine ones, but it's just incredibly helpful to see all the thinking that you've done, Danilyn. That's really exciting and really useful, really, really helpful. Two quick things I would add, and then we'll just move on to questions. Is sort of based on our broader discussions that we've had, you know, in the group, is one, the ways in which, when rethinking these methods, that anthropologists can think about the digital, because I think we need to take a strong stand against the digital as like a magic solution to everything. But we also need to take a stand against the tendency often in anthropology to say, oh, there's a digital divide, or I don't like that stuff. And the Deborah Lupton thing, doing fieldwork in a pandemic that you mentioned, that's on the AAA website, which is a 100-page long document about all kinds of ideas for online fieldwork, has almost no anthropologists in it. It's almost completely sociology, communications, informatics, and that's a lost opportunity, and sort of indicates ways in which we can contribute methodologically, I think, especially as the people that we're working with in many cases are themselves moving online in interesting ways. And then the other quick point I would make that came out of our conversations, when you're talking about these retoolings around method and conceptualization, that this is a way in which we are also, and including the current generation of researchers, doing rethinking work around around theory and concepts and what anthropology brings analytically to the table, and thinking back to the AIDS epidemic and work of people like Paula Treichler, how to have theory in an epidemic, that it's often in these moments when it seems, oh, we just have to make the immediate intervention, that thinking conceptually is often incredibly generative and powerful, and that is also a place where anthropology and anthropological research can make huge contributions. So with that, let's move on to ask questions of Danilyn. I'll try and keep track of people who want to ask questions, but I think it'd be nicer, Danilyn, to hear your voices. So why don't you unmute yourself and ask a question? And if you'd like to sort of go next, if people put their names in the chat, I'll keep a running list as for who's next, just to sort of move things along. So I'm going to mute myself, and whoever would like to start, once again, thank you so much, Danilyn, and let's keep the conversation going.
So to say something quick, just about what Tom just said. Yeah, I think the last point is really important. And that's why I say what we're endorsing is someone as a thinker, not just as a researcher, right? The kind of, there's theory and then there's methods. That division really, at this moment is going to be challenged in really important ways. So, yeah.
Don't be shy, folks. Any questions, big or small? And Danilyn's slides, because we're recording this, they will be on the recording. So you can always take a look at those later. They'll be on the recording.
Hello, Danilyn. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Hi, my name's Andrew McGrath, and I had a question about just the particulars of the changes to dependent funding in cases of of work. So I guess is that something that you're just thinking about, people that are doing research being?
Yeah. So right now, like I said, we haven't gotten to the point where we have everything nailed down for the November 1, 2020 deadline, but I can tell you, what we're providing for current grantees and current applicants. And I think our provisions before was 50% of childcare costs, and you weren't eligible if there was another sort of, close member of your circle who was with you who could provide childcare, right? That was kind of like the limits we put on it. And I think we're removing, for our applicants and our grantees right now, we're removing both of those limits. So you can ask for 100%, childcare costs, and there's no sort of stipulation that there can't be another kind of person in your immediate circle who's available in your household, right? We just understand that this is a moment at which, the burden of dependent care, obviously it's always falls unequally, by gender and all sorts of other things. It's just a moment where that can be a real obstacle for people who are trying to make progress in their research. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
So it looks like Anith, you have a question, and then Jessica. So do you want to go ahead and go first, Anith, and then Caitlin? So we have 3 people in the queue. So Anith, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure, I'll just unmute. I just asked in the chat if Wenner-Gren is encouraging more of a focus on the anthropology of the US, given border closures and current political crisis, including racial crisis and COVID-19, et cetera. Anthropology of the US has its own experts, but is there going to be more of a focus on that moving forward?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it kind of raises a broader question. I mean, I think of like our grants as empty boxes into which whatever great ideas there are in the field, you know, can fit, right? So we don't encourage or discourage any particular kind of research. I do think, again, for researchers really thinking about these questions of feasibility, what's your plan B, et cetera, I kind of expect there to be more research that is oriented to people's local places. And we don't just fund researchers based in the United States, we fund researchers based all over the world. So I think it's possible that more people will be doing research that's more proximate to their home spaces, just because of the possibility of travel restrictions. But it's not like we're gonna prioritize that kind of work, right? It's just a question of one of those aspects of feasibility that in people putting together their projects, they're gonna need to be thinking about. So, you know, it's a good question. I mean, again, when we kind of try to anticipate how anthropology is going to change, you know, more collaborative work, bringing people together across sort of national boundaries, that's one sort of possibility for changes and, you know, whatever, possibly really positive changes in the field. More research that's closer to people's home places, I think that's another strong possibility. So I hope that helps, right? Yeah. So it's always a mistake to like try to suss out what we're looking for, because we're looking for things we don't know even exist yet, right? So really, you know, think about where your passions are, you know, and what really kind of works for you in terms of the questions you want to answer.
Great. And Danilyn, we have 3 more questions in the queue. So just as a time check, would it be okay if we went until 1:15?
Sure, that's just fine.
Okay, great. So the next question is from Jessica.
Hi, I have a question about whether you're anticipating future austerity measures in terms of the amount of available funding. And I'm just thinking about this in terms of whether it's strategic to apply to the November 1st deadline or the May 1st, 2021 deadline, because I since one of this past May's deadline was canceled, I'm wondering, are there going to be twice as many applicants for the November 1st deadline and, you know, half the amount of available funds? So I'm just wondering about kind of what that landscape looks like, but I understand you don't have a crystal ball to really know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think, you know, one thing to say is, it wasn't that we're canceling the May 1 deadline forever. That was a decision made in a moment of kind of like when we actually had to act quickly, and there were reasons why we felt like it made sense at this point. In terms of austerity, we are an endowment funded institution. Like, we don't do any fundraising. So we're really, which is a wonderful thing, because it means we're not beholden to any other funders, right? We really can use the money for the field itself. You know, at the same time, that does tie us into global financial markets. Sadly, I mean, I think as a human being, sadly, it's like those markets have been doing much better than average folks around the world, right? So to date, our endowment has gone down something like 10%, but it's actually rebounded significantly. That was at the low point. You know, our investments are actually doing okay right now. We don't know what the next 6 months holds, right? And we do, you know, obviously we can only work with the resources we have. I mean, at this point, I'm not anticipating us, you know, significantly reducing our budget for grants. Will there be more applications at November 1st? That's possible. I mean, in addition to doing a strategic plan, all these other things, we've switched over to some new technology. And like, these are questions that drives me crazy that I can't just immediately answer. Like, at the May 1st deadline, which has a much smaller number of applicants, how many of those are resubmissions from the November 1st, right? And kind of like, who are the people applying? How many are fresh applicants? I don't really know that. And if I knew that, that would kind of help me a little bit more with the November 1st. So yeah, I really don't know what that's going to look like. I would say just my advice to an individual potential applicant is, if you're ready to apply, apply. It does not hurt you to apply. You know, there's a joke in the development world: if you want money, ask for advice. If you want advice, ask for money. I mean, we don't provide everyone with money, but we do provide everyone with advice, and you could hopefully get some really useful feedback on your project, even if you don't end up getting funded this round, which would prepare you to apply at May 1st, perhaps with a greater chance of success. So yeah, this is a question that we've been asked, and we really, we don't know, and we don't know what to anticipate. So yeah. And again, the longer term, it really has to do with how much funding is available to universities to even have graduate programs. So, I think there are going to be some ups and downs in terms of our application rates in the coming couple of years.
Caitlin has a really great question that we discussed with Jeff Mance as well. So go ahead, Caitlin. Caitlin's microphone is not working, so I am Caitlin. And Caitlin is asking, what kinds of tips do you have for students who can't do preliminary field work during this time? Because in anthropology, traditionally, summer field work in the first, second, third year, or whatever, is often a backbone for devising a successful grant application for, could be language learning, getting to know local scholars, all that kind of stuff. Without this preliminary data, we also might not have previous field notes to draw from. So do you have any thoughts or tips about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just what I was saying before, again, really deepening your contextual knowledge, deepening your historical knowledge, and also just, I mean, yeah, you may not be able to travel to visit, colleagues in their offices, in their universities, in the place where you want to work, but you can be in touch with them through remote methods, through emails, through letters, just recognizing that a lot of people are not, it's like a world in which everyone is kind of engaging in these ways. So, I would recommend really taking the time to do the kind of preliminary work that, you might not have had time if you were just thinking about how can I get to the field and start doing this. In terms of language learning, that's an interesting question. It seems to me, depending on the language, there may be some online resources that you could think about tapping into. The field notes, materials from other scholars, it seems to me that's still available. There are a bunch of things that you can still do that, will allow you to do kind of some preliminary work, which will help you refine your project. Again, it's not the same thing as showing up and getting the kind of firsthand experience that people often are able to get, but really thinking creatively about what are all the avenues of access to what's happening in your site. Thinking about that can be useful too. Another thing is like local media. This is something that, again, just shows my age, right? When I was doing fieldwork, I kept a clipping file of, the local Irianese, as it was called at the time, newspaper, which was just incredibly useful, right? Now a bunch of that stuff is online. So really thinking about local media as well as a way to kind of get a feel for what's happening in your field site. What are people talking about? What are people worrying about? So yeah, I mean, the advice for preliminary work isn't that different from the advice for your work more generally. Yeah.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Ellen has a question.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. My question is related to what you were speaking about before, that kind of ethical and safety dimensions of fieldwork going forward. I'm currently in the field, and I'm wondering if Wenner-Gren is planning to do any kind of guidelines or anything like that on when it is safe to resume fieldwork, how to decide if it's safe to resume fieldwork, because I'm in a place right now, everything I've read online says follow state and local guidelines, but I'm not in a place where I feel that the state and local guidelines are particularly reliable. And so, I mean, it could be worse, but obviously I've been in touch with my advisor about that, but I would love any kind of, I'm a Wenner-Gren grantee also, so.
Yeah, I know you, I recognize you.
Thoughts you have.
Yeah, no, of course. No, thank you for that question. It is kind of the question. This is really what we're trying to figure out right now. And it seems like advisors, institutional review boards are going to be important too. In terms of the mechanisms that we have in place, we always ask people to do safety statements, and we ask people for local permission. Before we grant something, the IRB is the sort of starting point, but there are other sorts of ways in which we try to make sure that local communities are aware of and are consenting to having the person in their midst. So really thinking about how you're accessing that kind of local knowledge will be important. Ultimately for us, it's like, you're going to have to just be able to make the case that the moment has come, right? And it's actually kind of an interesting conceptual problem too, because it seems to me one of the limits of the IRB system when it comes to ethnography is, you know, people sign these consent forms, but no one signs a form knowing exactly what they're consenting to, because we don't know what they're consenting to. You never know what's going to become of the research that you do. And there are always these differences in knowledge about what this research could do, right? So in some ways, this is a moment that kind of challenges the sort of romantic idea of anthropology that we just simply live in the ontology of the people we're researching. We're never fully in the same ontology. There are differences in risks, there are differences in knowledge. So, you know, this is a situation in which people may be like, oh, it's fine for us to do all sorts of face-to-face things, but you have access to information that suggests it's not fine, right? So it's going to be a really delicate ethical dance for ethnographers. The kind of easy solutions we had are kind of not going to be there. And for us, I think, is a foundation in terms of when we're saying, go for it, spend our money on traveling and doing face-to-face meetings, it's going to be both sort of what kinds of information are you providing us, but also a sense that you're thinking really hard about these questions. Because again, like I said before, we support thinkers, not just projects, you know, and that includes we support thinkers who are really thinking about these ethical and safety sorts of considerations. So I know that's totally unhelpful, but I'm just encouraging people to think hard about these things, and, you know, when the moment comes, really communicating with Mary Beth and me, and, you know, there will be a back and forth about it, you know, is what I would anticipate. Yeah.
And we have one last question from Chandra.
Hi, Danilyn. Thanks so much for doing this. It's really helpful. So I have two questions about the post-PhD research grants, and I apologize if you spoke to this earlier. I got on late. The first of which is the change in the funding parameters that you listed in one of your slides. Do those apply to those grants as well?
Yep.
Okay, excellent.
Absolutely.
And then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying absolutely. That's
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
Cool. And then the second question is more along the lines of Jessica's earlier question, which is, if there's austerity, is there a weight towards the dissertation grants, or is it kind of flat? Like, how do you think about these within the ecosystem of, you know, anthropology in general?
No, it's interesting. Like I said, again, we did the strategic planning, and it was incredibly useful, because it used to be that when Wenner-Gren had to pull back budgets, they just took 10% across the board, whatever. And my thinking is we really want to do cuts strategically, thinking about what our priorities are. I will say that one thing that came out of that process was a commitment to research grants, right? You know, that this is the largest part of our budget as a foundation, and this is something we do. If we're not doing it, who is, right? One of the slight adjustments that came out of the discussion around this, something that's really, really troubled us, is we've been historically extremely poor at funding scholars based in the global South. Mm-hmm. Right? And kind of thinking about questions of precarity. You know, it's like the majority, you know, embarrassingly enough, right? I mean, whatever, this troubles me, but it's sort of like, if you look at who we're funding, you know, students. They may not all be US citizens, but a lot of them are based at US institutions, and a lot of them are based in a handful of US institutions. It's just kind of like, yeah, the sort of privileging of that and how that fits into disciplinary hierarchies is something that troubles me. So one of the sort of small changes we made was a slight readjustment of success rates, increasing the success rate for post-PhD, understanding that in a lot of places, the whole model, I mean, that's the other thing too. It's like the model of dissertation fieldwork grants doesn't make sense in a lot of parts of the world. You know, for example, in Brazil, where historically, you know, kind of you're doing research among local communities, right? And you used to be able to get grants to go abroad. You went abroad to think alongside people, right? It wasn't sort of, so this idea, it's like, oh, you learn your theory here and you go there to do research. Right. That's a very distinctive model of research too. So we were taking all those things into account. You know, all that being said, we totally understand dissertation fieldwork students. You know, right now it's a really tough moment. So I wouldn't expect us to further raise the post-PhD and lower the dissertation fieldwork, but my kind of sense is if we have to cut budgets, we would do it evenly across both those groups.
Great, thank you so much. It's helpful to hear how you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Just to close, obviously, thank you so much for doing this. And also, I'm just so honored and thankful that in our discipline, we have people like you and Jeff Mance who, you know, have purse strings and are overseeing funding, but are also acting as intellectual leaders and support systems for the discipline. And from your position, you're able to see and do things that no one else can do. And it's just so incredibly meaningful and helpful to people, more than you realize, I think, whether it be graduate students, post-PhDs, faculty. It's incredibly important work that you're doing. And we're just so thankful that you are doing it. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us with everything that's going on today. And we're here for you. You know, we're just so thankful that you've done this. So we're all virtually clapping right now, virtual hands. Thank you, Ellen. We're getting some other hand claps there coming up. We're getting it in the chat as well. So we're getting, love is coming through the wires, through the tubes. But yes, thank you so much for doing it.
We answer questions. We love getting emails, our inquiry line, you know, I answer questions. So if anything comes up, then you need to contact me.
Yeah, Danilyn's easy to find, but if you can't see her email, obviously shoot me an email and I'll give it. And like I said, I've recorded this. I think Olga has as well. So we'll make it available, and it will obviously have the slides as part of that, as well as the Q&A, so you can access all of that. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Have a good week. I'll see you here and there online. Week 10. We're almost there. We're almost there. Keep going.